Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today we are going to be speaking about the so-called Ottoman Interregnum or Ottoman Civil War, and some of the challenges the Ottomans had as they were increasing their territory, expanding, et cetera, et cetera. But to make sense of all this, let's just look at a map real quick. Let me share my screen, in which we'll see again just how quickly and geographically expansively the Ottomans expanded. This is around 1300. The Ottomans are one of these little polities here. Let's go a bit quicker. This again is the Centennia map, which is able to show a bit more information over time. So right around now, 1314, you have something called the Ottoman Emirate, one of the many emirates here. And it's going to, start expanding, taking over parts of little pieces of Byzantium here. And then it's going to continue to fight with all these other guys, other emirates. But now it's going to push towards this area. It's conquered Bursa by 1340s. And it's made headway into essentially what's Thrace, and quickly taken over the Balkans. And as we can see, it's expanding both into Anatolia, but specifically into the Balkans. So it really has northwest Anatolia and the Balkans heavily in the 1380s, 90s. So by 1387, it's probably the major power in this whole area, right? It has the entirety of the Balkans, Serbia, etc. And quickly, as you can see, grabs the entirety, this western half of Anatolia. So by 1394, it's really expanding, consolidating power, almost everything. Seems like everything's about to fall to Ottoman hands. But then this big purple blob comes here and breaks up the Ottomans once again. That purple blob is Timur or Tamerlane, as we'll see. And his defeat of the Ottomans was a major setback for them, and started off a sort of civil war or interregnum period between the Ottomans in different ways. So we were going to see, and it took them another few decades to reconsolidate and reconquer this area from a variety of different people. But let's stop this and go to the presentation. So we are talking about the period between 1402 to 1413 called the Ottoman Civil War or Interregnum. Interregnum just means between rulers. And it all started when this guy, Timur, Temur, or in English known as Tamerlane, it's because his name was Timur Lang, Timur the Lame, apparently because he suffered from a fall as a young man that made him unable to use his leg, but that's okay because most of the time he was riding horses. Timur was basically a minor nomadic figure from Central Asia, who was operating in about a century and a half after the Mongol conquest. So the Mongol conquests are still relatively fresh in this period. When the time he was born, there had been about 80 years since the Mongols had come. There was Mongol princelings and descendants throughout Central Asia and the Middle East. It was common to find these sorts of people. And Timur was basically a sort of cattle rustler, a nomadic fighter who was very good at consolidating power, leading armies, etc. And from his base in Samarkand, which is today in Uzbekistan, managed to quickly expand and create a very large empire that basically tried to recreate the Mongols in the Mongol Empire. Of course, he didn't conquer China, but he did actually end up making some of the same attacks and fights that the Mongols did in the Middle East. So he really recreated the empire of the Middle East, the Mongol Empire in the Middle East, that is the Ilkhanid Empire. And he did so also by recreating their military tactics, often demanding that cities surrender to him or suffering a very grisly fate. And if cities refused to surrender, then he would basically, once he conquered them, would massacre the inhabitants. And this happened to a few different places. But for the most part, again, like the Mongols, this was avoided by cities successfully surrendering to him. Now, why does this matter? One is that as he moved over here and became this kind of flood of military power moving towards the West, and he arrived in places like Syria and Egypt and Anatolia, he encounters a lot of people that are disgruntled at the Ottomans because the Ottomans have increasingly pushed them out, have all these other emirates and people and tribes from power. And therefore, they petitioned Timur to essentially defeat the Ottomans, which he handily does at this Battle of Ankara in 1402. It very quickly becomes clear that the Ottomans stand no chance. So Sultan Bayezid I heads to meet Timur, but all of his vassals and allies immediately abandon him, except for his janissaries and some Serbian troops. So he basically has no support from his nomadic warriors or from his other vassals or other groups. All he has ultimately is the Christian troops or the Christian slave troops in the case of the janissaries. So this is a major defeat for the Ottomans. Bayezid is actually captured and he's dragged back in a cage back to Samarkand, along with two of his sons, Musa and Mustafa, who are kept as surety. One of the common tactics in pre-modern warfare is that you bring the sons of a ruler that you defeat. That way, later on, you can release them and they can go and make a challenge, a claim for the throne against their brothers, etc. And that's precisely what Timur did later on. Timur is not interested in ruling Anatolia or controlling it. He just leaves a power vacuum there and lets everyone kind of revert to back to what was there before the Ottomans. Now, two things. One is that this episode in which Bayezid is captured by Timur captures the imagination of people throughout the Islamic world, but also in Europe. The idea of the unstoppable Ottomans, at least in Europe, being captured by a nomadic warrior was a romantic one. It was something that grabbed people's attention and imagination, and it was reimagined by Western painters. Here's Timur dressed in the 19th century depiction, basically dressed in a Central Asian ikat. I don't know if he really wore that. And here's the Sultan Bayezid kind of being woken from his nap or from his DS to being forced to greet Timur. This scene also was depicted in different versions. This is a Mughal miniature. Let's go back here, where we have again Timur on a throne in Sultan Bayezid bound, brought forth before him. This even took the form of operas. Some of the most famous operas depict the capture of Bayezid by Timur and how that worked out. Now, for our purposes, the other effect of the capture of Bayezid is the idea that it set off a civil war. So one of the things that we talked about before is that the Ottomans, like other Turco-Mongol powers, practiced a form of political succession called tanistry. It just means that instead of having one son succeed the father or the king, any male heir could technically make a claim to the throne. And often what would happen is that the kingdom would be split between any number of male heirs, so usually even uncles or sons, etc., would then split up the realm, usually between 3 or 4 people. The Ottomans were a bit different in that they did not allow this to happen. Their political practice was that any son could potentially be an heir, could potentially be the ruler, but only one person could inherit the kingdom. So they didn't keep splitting up their kingdom every generation. And the fact that Bayezid was captured essentially meant that there was no one to designate an heir, but also that the usual way it worked is that upon the death of the Sultan, everyone would kind of rush back to the capital to consolidate their power and to fight the other brothers. In this case, it wasn't quite clear. Each of the brothers had different power bases, and in fact, the usual way was that a Ottoman prince would be sent off to a province with a tutor called the Lala, and there would learn to govern essentially from kind of mid-adolescence onwards. And at the time of the father's death, they would basically vie with each other to take over the empire. So there was a sort of mini civil war every time, at every succession. But this one was particularly bad and particularly brutal because no one was able to consolidate power easily. No one was able to make a quick and clean claim to the throne. And so we had a number of sons, 5 sons. 3 of them already had power bases, which is Mehmed, Isa, and Suleiman. And if we remember, if we go back here, he takes 2 of the sons, Timur takes 2 of the sons, Musa and Mustafa, here without a power base, back to Samarkand and releases them over the years to basically disrupt the politics. So each time that one of these guys is about to win, Musa Mustafa, is released, raises an army, and then poses a challenge to whoever's the victor. Now, what we see here is that each of these guys has a different city under his command. Amasya is in kind of central Anatolia. Bursa was the first major city the Ottomans conquered. South of the Sea of Marmara, Edirne is the north frontier capital. Each of them has a different power base. Long story short, basically Mehmed wins, but it takes quite a while. It takes a number of years, and it takes a set of major compromises on the part of the prince. As you can see, it takes basically 11 years for Mehmed to eventually win. In the aftermath of that civil war, the empire was quite weakened. It had lost large portions of its territory, in which the previous rulers had kind of regained control, especially in Anatolia, not in the Balkans. The Balkans remained specifically a stronghold of the Ottomans. But especially in Anatolia, there was all sorts of experiments, spaces of different political freedom. And it also was moments of rebellion and experimentation. One of those is this rebellion by a guy named Sheikh Bedreddin, alongside another rebel called Berklüce Mustafa. Sheikh Bedreddin was, as we'll see in a second, was both a Sufi sheikh and in some senses also a learned scholar. He and Berklüce Mustafa raised an entire rebellion in this peninsula called the Karaburun Peninsula, today very close to Izmir, in which they managed to bring together a highly unusual coalition of actors to unify and rebel against Ottoman rule. So this included Turkoman, so nomadic Turks, Sufis, Christian peasants, and apparently also Jews as well. So they managed to make a coalition of the broad populations in that area. And what pushed him and what he was apparently preaching was a sort of new messianic religion in which he would abolish private property and end injustice. So this, again, already people are feeling at the end of this frontier period that some people are getting more than others. There's growing inequality. Some are rich while others are poor. And he's going to bring an end to that and resort back to the equal days of beforehand. But who exactly was Bedreddin? Yeah. Bedr ad-Din himself was the son of a frontier lord and a Christian mother, so he already combined those. He also combined other aspects of this world. He was to some degree a Sufi sheikh, but he also was trained in Egypt in law, in the traditional Islamic studies. So he kind of had a foot in all these different worlds, and then he returned back to Anatolia. There, he managed to transform himself into a sort of popular Sufi sheikh. And again, it shows you just how charismatic and powerful these Sufi sheikhs were, these Sufi leaders, because almost every rebellion during the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s against the Ottomans, or any rebellion in this entire area, is going to be led by some combination of Turkish nomadic power combined with a Sufi sheikh. In this case, he also brings in other people, Christian peasants and so forth, into the coalition in a very unique fashion. Now, ultimately, this rebellion did not work. Once Mehmed had consolidated power, he was able to march on this area and essentially kill the rebels completely and eliminate them as a cause. But his legend lived on, and especially it was revived in the 20th century by a very famous poet and writer called Nazim Hikmet. Nazim Hikmet was probably the most important communist writer in Turkey in the early 20th century. And for him, he went back and took this story of Bedr ad-Din and saw in it a model of someone who's fighting for injustice, an attempt to abolish private property, just as the communists wanted, and was pulling together all the different threads of Ottoman society. So, both peasants and nomads, Christians and Muslims, and everyone else. So he basically wrote a very long poem epic called the story of the legend of Bedr ad-Din. And here we have Bedr ad-Din transformed since the 1930s into a sort of leftist hero. And in fact, ultimately, Nazim Hikmet was exiled from Turkey in the 1930s, and he moved to Moscow, where he continued to write poetry and stories. And so we have, for example, this Soviet postage stamp commemorating Nazim Hikmet. If you can read Cyrillic, you can see this is Nazim Hikmet here. So with that, keep that in mind, because we're going to be speaking about future rebellions, a much more serious one created by a guy, a Sufi sheikh named Shah Ismail, that really challenged the Ottomans in a much more serious fashion in a few decades.